Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in gentle detail to help you drift into restful sleep. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a journey through the Viking Age, a period that lasted roughly 300 years and forever changed the face of medieval Europe, the North Atlantic, and even parts of Asia. Get comfortable, adjust your pillows, take a deep breath. As we travel back over 1,000 years, let the rhythm of history wash over you. There's no need to remember every detail. Just listen, relax, and let yourself drift. The world before the Vikings. To understand the Viking Age, we must first understand the world into which these Scandinavian peoples emerged. In the late 8th century, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, and tribal territories. The Roman Empire had fallen centuries before, leaving behind a fragmented landscape of successor states. In what we now call England, 7 major kingdoms competed for power and prestige. These were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, collectively known as the Heptarchy. Each kingdom had its own king, its own court, and its own ambitions. Christianity had taken root across these lands, spreading from Ireland and the Mediterranean, bringing with it monasteries, learning, and treasures. The Frankish Empire, under the Carolingian dynasty, dominated much of continental Europe. Charlemagne would soon unite vast territories under his rule, becoming the first Holy Roman Emperor in 800. But in 793, that coronation was still years away. In Scandinavia, the lands we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were home to a complex mosaic of chieftains, petty kingdoms, and tribal confederations. These were not unified nations, but rather collections of communities bound by kinship, custom, and shared language. The people who lived there were skilled farmers, craftsmen, and seafarers. They worshipped gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. They told stories of giants and heroes around long fires in the dark winter nights. The climate was harsh, but not unbearable. The growing season was short, and life required constant labour. Families lived in longhouses, rectangular buildings with turf roofs and walls of timber or stone. Inside, there was usually one large room where people cooked, ate, worked, and slept. Animals might share the space during the coldest months, their body heat adding warmth. Society was stratified. At the top were the Jarls, powerful chieftains who controlled land and commanded warriors. Below them were the Carls, free farmers who worked their own land and could bear arms. At the bottom were the thralls, enslaved people captured in raids or born into bondage, who had few rights and performed the hardest labour. Trade had existed for centuries. Scandinavians had long journeyed across the Baltic Sea and down the rivers of what would become Russia, trading furs, amber, and walrus ivory for silver, silks, and other goods from the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. They built trading posts and seasonal camps, learning the waterways and the peoples who lived along them. But something changed as the 8th century drew to a close. The reasons are still debated by historians. Perhaps the climate improved slightly, allowing for population growth. Perhaps new ship designs made longer voyages more feasible. Perhaps political consolidation in Scandinavia pushed ambitious men to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Perhaps it was simply the accumulation of knowledge about the wealthy, relatively defenceless monasteries and towns across the sea. Whatever the causes, the result was dramatic. The people of Scandinavia, whom we now call Vikings, would spend the next 3 centuries exploring, raiding, trading, and settling across vast stretches of the known world. They would reach Iceland, Greenland, and North America. They would found kingdoms in Ireland, England, and Normandy. They would establish a state in what would become Russia. They would serve as elite guards for the Byzantine emperor. And it all began with a monastery on a windswept island off the coast of Northumbria. Lindisfarne, the first strike. The year was 793. The date was June 8th. On the island of Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, a community of monks went about their daily routines. This was no ordinary monastery. Founded in 634 by Saint Aidan, Lindisfarne had become one of the most important centres of Christianity in northern England. It was home to beautiful illuminated manuscripts, ornate crosses, and treasures of gold and silver donated by the pious. The island sat just off the Northumbrian coast, connected to the mainland by a causeway that disappeared at high tide. It was remote but not isolated, peaceful but not entirely secluded. The monks prayed, copied texts, farmed small plots of land, and tended to pilgrims who came to venerate the relics of St. Cuthbert, who had died more than 100 years before. The attack came without warning. Ships appeared on the horizon, low and sleek, with dragon heads carved on their prows. These were longships, the signature vessels of the Scandinavian raiders. Powered by both oars and sail, they could navigate deep oceans and shallow rivers alike, could beach on almost any shore. The raiders who poured from these ships were unlike anything the monks had encountered. They came with axes, spears, and swords. They came for wealth, and the monastery had wealth in abundance. Gold chalices, silver candlesticks, jewelled reliquaries, fine vestments, all were seized. The raiders killed some monks, captured others to sell as slaves, and left the monastery in ruins. The shock rippled across Christian Europe. The scholar Alcuin of York, who was at Charlemagne's court when news arrived, wrote in anguish, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets." To medieval Christians, this wasn't just a robbery. It was sacrilege, an assault on God's house by heathens who knew no reverence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year record of events in England, noted ominous portents before the raid: fierce lightning storms, whirlwinds, fiery dragons seen flying through the air. Whether these were real atmospheric phenomena or later additions to the narrative, they reflected the profound unease the attack provoked. But for the raiders themselves, this was likely just a particularly successful plundering expedition. Monasteries were soft targets. They were wealthy but poorly defended. The monks weren't warriors. There were no thick walls or armed garrisons, just treasure for the taking. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't actually the first Scandinavian attack on the British Isles. A few years earlier, in 787, 3 ships had landed at Portland on the southern coast of Wessex. When a royal official rode out to meet them, assuming they were traders and intending to direct them to the king's estate to pay customs, the visitors killed him. But this earlier incident was brief and isolated. Lindisfarne was different. It was more violent, more traumatic, and more widely reported. After Lindisfarne, the raids continued. In 794, the monastery at Jarrow was attacked. In 795, raiders struck Iona, the famous monastery off the Scottish coast. These were hit-and-run attacks. The raiders came in summer, when the seas were calm and the days long. They struck quickly and withdrew before any organised defence could form. Then they sailed home to Scandinavia with their plunder, ready to return the following year. For the next several decades, this pattern persisted. Small fleets, seasonal raids, coastal targets. The raiders learned which monasteries were richest, which routes were safest, which defences could be bypassed. They became bolder, venturing farther inland along rivers, sometimes wintering in coastal camps rather than sailing home. In England, the raids disrupted trade, terrified coastal populations, and prompted some defensive measures. King Offa of Mercia had already been organising coastal defences before Lindisfarne. After the raids intensified, other kingdoms followed suit, but defensive preparations were sporadic and poorly coordinated. The 7 kingdoms of England often fought each other as much as they united against external threats. The Great Heathen Army. The year 865 marked a turning point. That year, a massive Viking force, known to history as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. This wasn't a raid, it was an invasion. The army was led by several chieftains, most notably the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary Viking whose historicity is debated, but whose sons, Ivar, the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, certainly existed. According to later sagas, Ragnar had been captured and killed by King Ella of Northumbria, thrown into a pit of snakes. Whether this actually happened is uncertain. What's clear is that the Great Heathen Army came to conquer, not just to plunder. The Vikings demanded horses from the East Anglians, who complied, perhaps hoping to buy them off. But the Vikings didn't leave. Instead, they used the horses to move swiftly inland, something earlier raiders had rarely done. They set up a fortified camp at Thetford and spent the winter there, preparing for campaigns in the spring. In 866, they marched north to Northumbria. That kingdom was in turmoil. 2 rival kings, Aelle and Osbert, were fighting for the throne. The Vikings seized the city of York, called Jorvik by the Scandinavians, which would become one of the most important Viking settlements in England. Aelle and Osbert briefly set aside their rivalry to reclaim the city, but their assault failed. Both kings were killed in the battle. Northumbrian resistance collapsed. The Vikings installed a puppet king and effectively controlled the kingdom. Over the next several years, the Great Heathen Army moved through England like a scythe. In 869, they conquered Mercia, the most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In 870, they attacked Wessex in the south. King Ethelred of Wessex and his younger brother Alfred fought back, but initially with limited success. Then in 871, Ethelred died. Alfred, still in his early 20s, became King of Wessex at a desperate hour. The kingdom was under siege. The Vikings seemed unstoppable. Many believed it was only a matter of time before all of England fell under Scandinavian control. Alfred, however, proved remarkably resilient. He fought a series of battles, won some and lost others, and in 878 negotiated a peace with the Viking leader Guthrum. According to the terms, Guthrum and his followers would withdraw from Wessex and settle in the eastern part of England, a region that came to be known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw was a compromise. It acknowledged Viking control over roughly the northern and eastern third of England, including East Anglia, most of Mercia, and Northumbria. In these areas, Scandinavian laws, customs, and settlers predominated. Place names still reflect this Viking heritage. Any English town ending in by, which means farm or settlement in Old Norse, was likely founded or heavily influenced by Vikings. The same goes for thorp, meaning village, and thwaite, meaning meadow. Alfred used the breathing room to reform his military and administrative systems. He built fortified towns called burhs, creating a network of defensible positions throughout Wessex. He reorganized the fyrd, the militia, so that part of it was always mobilized while others farmed. He commissioned ships to challenge Viking naval superiority, and he promoted learning and literacy, believing that an educated clergy and nobility would make for a more resilient society. Alfred's grandson, Ethelstan, would later conquer the Danelaw and become the first king to rule all of England, but that was in the future. For now, by the late 9th century, England was divided. Wessex remained Anglo-Saxon. The Danelaw was increasingly Scandinavian, but the great heathen army had done more than conquer territory. It had demonstrated that Vikings weren't just raiders. They could organize sustained campaigns, govern occupied lands, and integrate into local societies, even while maintaining their distinct identity. Viking expansion across Europe. While the great heathen army campaigned in England, other Viking groups were active across Europe. In Francia, the rivers became highways for Scandinavian longships. The Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, these and other rivers saw Viking fleets rowing upstream, raiding cities and monasteries far from the coast. Paris was besieged multiple times. In 845, the Vikings sacked the city. In 885 to 886, they laid siege to it again. This time, the defenders held out, famously led by Count Odo, who became a hero of the siege. The Vikings eventually withdrew after being paid a large ransom. The Carolingian Empire, which had seemed so mighty under Charlemagne, was fracturing. After Charlemagne's death in 814, his grandsons divided the empire in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. Internal strife weakened the ability to mount coordinated defences against external threats. Vikings exploited these divisions ruthlessly. In 911, however, a different solution was tried. King Charles the Simple of West Francia negotiated with a Viking leader named Rollo. According to the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, Rollo and his followers would settle in the lower Seine Valley, convert to Christianity, and pledge fealty to Charles. In exchange, they received legal recognition of their control over the territory, which became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. This was a brilliant, if risky, strategy. Charles effectively deputized the Vikings to defend against other Vikings, while also gaining nominal sovereignty over them. Rollo, or Hrolf, as he was known in Old Norse, did convert, though perhaps not with deep conviction. His descendants, however, became thoroughly Frankish in culture. They adopted the French language, married into local nobility, and built churches and castles. Within a few generations, the Normans, as they came to be called, were among the most formidable warriors in Europe, but their identity was now more French than Scandinavian. In 1066, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, would invade and conquer England, bringing Norman rule to the island his ancestor had once raided. Meanwhile, in Ireland, Vikings established a series of coastal settlements that grew into important trading cities. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick all began as Viking trading posts. Dublin, in particular, became a major centre of the Viking world, rivaling York in importance. The Irish landscape was politically fragmented, divided among dozens of small kingdoms that owed loose allegiance to regional over-kings. This fragmentation made coordinated resistance difficult, and Vikings were able to carve out enclaves, sometimes allying with one Irish king against another. But the relationship was complex. While Vikings raided monasteries and fought Irish armies, they also traded with Irish merchants, married Irish women, and sometimes converted to Christianity. Over time, a hybrid Norse-Gaelic culture emerged in the Viking settlements, blending Scandinavian and Celtic elements. In Scotland, Vikings settled extensively in the northern and western Isles, the Shetlands, Orkneys, and Hebrides. These islands became so thoroughly Scandinavian that Old Norse was spoken there for centuries. The Orkney earldom, established in the late 9th century, was one of the most powerful political entities in the North Atlantic for several hundred years. From these island bases, Vikings also raided and settled parts of mainland Scotland. The Kingdom of the Isles, also called the Kingdom of Man and the Isles, was a Viking polity that controlled the Isle of Man and the Hebrides from the 10th to 13th centuries. Everywhere they went, Vikings adapted to local conditions while maintaining their core identity. They were remarkably pragmatic. They would raid one year and trade the next. They would fight Christians one day and convert the next. They preserved their language and myths, but also absorbed local customs. This flexibility was part of their success. The settlement of Iceland. Not all Viking expansion was about conquest. Some was about finding new land to farm and live on. Nowhere is this clearer than in the settlement of Iceland. Iceland had been known to Irish monks, who may have visited the island as early as the 8th century, but it was essentially uninhabited when Norse explorers arrived around 870. According to the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, the first permanent Norse settler was Ingolfur Arnason, who established a farmstead at Reykjavik around 874. Over the next several decades, thousands of Norwegians, along with some Swedes, Danes, and Norse Gaels from Ireland and Scotland, migrated to Iceland. They were fleeing political consolidation in Norway, where King Harald Fairhair was unifying the country under his rule, or seeking new opportunities, or simply looking for adventure. The settlers claimed land by performing a ritual. A chieftain would throw his high seat pillars, sacred carved posts from his home, overboard as he approached Iceland. Wherever the pillars washed ashore, he would claim that land as his own. This ritual connected the new land to the old, sanctifying the claim. Iceland offered abundant grazing land, rich fishing waters, and no native population to displace. The settlers established farms, raised sheep and cattle, and fished. The climate was challenging, colder than Norway, and trees were scarce, which made building difficult, but the land was fertile enough to support a modest population. Politically, Iceland developed a unique system. There was no king. Instead, the island was divided into chieftaincies, and disputes were settled at assemblies called things. The most important assembly was the Althing, established around 930 at Ingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where tectonic plates meet. The Althing functioned as both a parliament and a court, where laws were recited, disputes judged, and alliances forged. Icelandic society was intensely literary. During the 13th century, Icelanders would write down the Sagas, long prose narratives recounting the lives and feuds of the early settlers and their descendants. These sagas, along with the poetic Edda and the prose Edda, preserve much of what we know about Norse mythology, history, and culture. Without the Icelandic literary tradition, our understanding of the Viking Age would be vastly poorer. Iceland also became a launching point for further exploration. From Iceland, Vikings would discover Greenland and, eventually, North America. Eric the Red in Greenland. Eric Thorvaldsson, known as Eric the Red because of his red hair and beard, was a Norwegian who moved to Iceland with his family. He was a violent man, quick to anger and not averse to killing. After being convicted of murder and outlawed from Iceland around 982, Eric decided to sail west. He had heard stories of a land sighted by sailors blown off course. Around 982, Eric set out with a small crew and found it a massive ice-covered island. Despite its forbidding appearance, there were areas along the southwestern and southeastern coasts where grass grew in summer, and the climate during the medieval warm period was somewhat milder than today. Eric spent 3 years exploring this land, then returned to Iceland. He called his discovery Greenland, a bit of marketing genius. The name was more inviting than Iceland, despite the reality that Greenland had far more ice. Eric reasoned, rightly, that a pleasant name would attract settlers. In 985, Eric led an expedition of about 25 ships back to Greenland. Only 14 made it. The others were lost to storms or turned back. But the colonists who did arrive established 2 main settlements: the eastern settlement near the southern tip and the western settlement farther up the west coast. The Greenland Norse lived much as they had in Iceland and Norway, raising livestock, hunting seals and walrus, and trading walrus ivory and polar bear hides back to Europe. But the environment was harsher. The growing season was even shorter, and they depended heavily on imported grain and timber. The Greenlanders also interacted with the indigenous Inuit, whom they called Skrallings. Relations were sometimes peaceful, involving trade, and sometimes hostile, involving skirmishes. The sagas record both types of encounters. Greenland remained a Norse colony for nearly 500 years. The settlements survived through the High Middle Ages, but by the 15th century they had vanished. The reasons are debated. Climate change as the medieval warm period ended, soil degradation, loss of trade connections, conflict with the Inuit, perhaps all of these. The last definitive contact with the Greenland Norse was in 1410. After that, they disappear from history, leaving behind only ruins and mysteries. Vinland, the discovery of North America. From Greenland, the next step westward was almost inevitable. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland based on reports of land sighted by another sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Leif and his crew found it. First, they came to a land of flat stones, which they called Helluland, likely Baffin Island. Then they sailed farther south to a forested land they named Markland, probably Labrador. Finally, they reached a more hospitable region with wild grapes growing, which Leif named Vinland, meaning wineland or possibly grassland, depending on interpretation. The exact location of Vinland has been debated for centuries. The sagas describe it as a place where winters were mild and rivers were full of salmon. In the 1960s, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, discovered Norse ruins at Lanceau Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. This is the only confirmed Viking site in North America and likely represents either Vinland itself or a base camp for exploring Vinland. The Norse tried to settle Vinland, but the attempts were short-lived. Unlike Iceland and Greenland, North America was not uninhabited. The sagas describe encounters with the Skrælings, who were likely either the ancestors of the Inuit or members of indigenous groups farther south. Some encounters were friendly, involving trade, but violence erupted. In one skirmish, the Norse were outnumbered and forced to retreat. After a few years, the Norse abandoned their North American settlements. The distances were too great, the conflicts too dangerous, and the benefits too uncertain compared to safer opportunities in Greenland and Iceland. But they had reached the New World nearly 500 years before Columbus, an extraordinary achievement of seamanship and courage, even if it didn't lead to permanent colonization. The Kievan ruse and the road to Byzantium. While Danes and Norwegians sailed west, Swedish Vikings, often called Varangians, looked east. They travelled across the Baltic Sea and up the rivers of what is now Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. These rivers, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, were highways through the forests and steppes, connecting Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates of Central Asia and the Middle East. Swedish traders had been making these journeys for some time, but in the 9th century their presence became more organized and politically significant. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, a historical text compiled in the early 12th century, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the region were in conflict and disarray. Around 862, they invited a Varangian chieftain named Rurik to come and rule over them. Rurik and his brothers established themselves at Novgorod and Beluzero. This account is semi-legendary and debated by scholars, but it's clear that Scandinavian warriors and traders did establish a significant presence in the region. They founded or took control of trading posts along the river routes. Over time, these posts grew into towns and cities: Novgorod, Smolensk, Kiev. The name Rus likely derives from a Finnic word for the Swedes, and it gave rise to the name Russia. The Kievan Rus, as this polity came to be known, was a fusion of Scandinavian leadership and Slavic population. The ruling elite were initially Scandinavian, but they quickly adopted Slavic language, customs, and religion. In 882, a Varangian prince named Oleg seized control of Kiev, making it the capital of his realm. Kiev was strategically located on the Dnieper River, controlling trade routes to the Black Sea and Byzantium. Oleg and his successors launched expeditions against Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 907, Oleg famously attacked Constantinople. The Byzantine chroniclers describe his fleet as vast, though numbers were likely exaggerated. Oleg did not take the city, which was protected by massive walls and the fearsome Greek fire, a combustible liquid that could burn on water, but he extracted a favourable trade treaty from the Byzantines. Under Oleg's successors, particularly Prince Vladimir the Great, the Kievan Rus grew into a major power. Vladimir faced a choice of religions. Emissaries from the Islamic Caliphates, the Catholic West, the Jewish Khazars, and the Orthodox Byzantines all sought to convert him. According to legend, Vladimir rejected Islam because it forbade alcohol, saying, "Drinking is the joy of the Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure." He chose Orthodox Christianity around 988, influenced by Byzantine culture and the strategic benefits of aligning with Constantinople. The conversion of the Kievan Rus was a pivotal moment in European history, shaping the religious and cultural identity of Russia and Eastern Europe for centuries to come. But the roots of the Kievan Rus lay in Viking enterprise. The Varangians had established the trade routes, founded the key cities, and provided the initial political structure. Over time, they were absorbed into the Slavic majority, but their legacy endured. The Varangian Guard, some Vikings who travelled east went all the way to Constantinople, where they entered the service of the Byzantine Emperor as elite soldiers. This unit, known as the Varangian Guard, became one of the most famous military formations of the medieval world. The Varangian Guard was established around 988 by Emperor Basil II, who needed reliable troops during a period of internal strife. He turned to warriors from the north, who had no ties to Byzantine factions and were known for their ferocity and loyalty. The Varangians served as the emperor's personal bodyguards, standing watch at the palace gates and accompanying the emperor in battle. They were well paid, often in gold, and enjoyed high status. Service in the guard became a rite of passage for ambitious young Scandinavians seeking wealth and glory. One of the most famous Varangians was Harald Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway. In his youth, Harald served in the Varangian Guard, fighting in campaigns across the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean. He amassed a fortune and gained a fearsome reputation before returning north. Harald's saga, and those of other Varangians, were told and retold in Scandinavia, inspiring others to seek their fortune in the east. Runestones in Sweden commemorate men who travelled to Greece, as Scandinavians called the Byzantine Empire, and many never returned. The Varangian Guard continued to exist for centuries, gradually recruiting from other regions as Scandinavian migration to Byzantium declined. But at its height, in the 10th and 11th centuries, it was a symbol of how far Vikings had travelled and how thoroughly they had integrated into the wider world. Viking society and daily life. To understand the Viking Age, we must understand how Vikings lived. What was daily life like for these people? What did they eat? How did they dress? What did they believe? Most Vikings were farmers. They lived in rural communities, tending to crops and livestock. The staple crops were barley, oats, and rye. They grew vegetables like cabbages, onions, and peas. They kept cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens. Fishing was also important, especially in coastal areas. The typical Viking longhouse was a single large room, about 15 to 30 metres long and 5 to 8 metres wide. The walls were made of timber, wattle, and daub, or stone, depending on what materials were available. The roof was turfed for insulation. Inside, there was a central hearth for cooking and warmth. Benches along the walls served as seating by day and beds by night. There were no separate bedrooms or much privacy. The entire household, which might include the farmer, his wife, their children, and any thralls or extended family, lived in close quarters. In winter, when days were short and work limited, people stayed inside much of the time, telling stories, making repairs to tools and clothing, and preparing for the next season. The diet was simple but adequate. Bread, porridge, fish, cheese, and butter were staples. Meat was eaten less frequently, often reserved for feasts and special occasions. Preservation techniques like smoking, salting, and drying were essential for surviving the winter. Mead, beer, and buttermilk were common beverages. Clothing was made from wool and linen. Men typically wore tunics and trousers, held up with belts. Women wore long dresses, often with a pinafore or apron over the top, fastened with brooches. Cloaks provided extra warmth. Leather shoes and boots protected the feet. In winter, furs and hides were worn. The wealthy displayed their status through jewelry and fine garments. Brooches, arm rings, and necklaces of silver or gold were prized possessions. Elaborate brooches, often shaped like animals or geometric patterns, fastened cloaks and dresses. These items were not just decorative, but also a portable form of wealth. Vikings were skilled craftsmen. Blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and nails. Carpenters built ships and houses. Weavers produced cloth. Potters made vessels for cooking and storage. These skills were passed down through families, and certain regions became known for particular crafts. Viking ships, the key to expansion. The Viking ship was perhaps the most important technological innovation of the age. Without their ships, Vikings could not have raided, traded, or settled as they did. Viking ships came in several types. The most famous is the longship, designed for warfare and raiding. Longships were sleek and fast, built for speed and maneuverability. They had shallow drafts, meaning they didn't sit deep in the water, so they could navigate rivers and beach on shores where other ships couldn't go. A typical longship might be 20 to 30 meters long and 5 meters wide. It was clinker built, with overlapping planks riveted together, giving it flexibility to handle rough seas. The keel, the central spine of the ship, ran the length of the hull, providing structural integrity. Longships were powered by both oars and sail. A medium-sized longship might have 30 oars, 15 per side, rowed by the crew. When the wind was favourable, a large square sail, often made of wool and sometimes striped or dyed, was raised. This combination allowed Vikings to travel long distances quickly and adjust to changing conditions. The largest longships were massive. The Gokstad ship, discovered in a burial mound in Norway and dating to around 900, was 23.8 meters long. The Oseberg ship, another burial ship from 834, was 21.5 meters. These ships were not only functional, but also beautiful, adorned with carvings and painted designs. For trade and transport, Vikings used knars, which were wider and deeper than longships. Knars were primarily sail-powered and could carry large cargoes. They were the workhorses of Viking commerce, transporting goods like timber, furs, and walrus ivory across the North Atlantic. Building a ship required immense skill and labour. The hull had to be perfectly balanced. The planks had to be shaped and fitted precisely. The rigging had to be strong and well designed. A single ship might take months or even years to construct, involving an entire community's efforts. Navigating these ships required equally impressive skill. Vikings had no compasses or sextants. They navigated by the sun, stars, and landmarks. They observed birds, the colour of the water, and the patterns of waves. They may have used sunstones, a type of crystal that can detect polarized light and thus indicate the sun's position even on cloudy days, though evidence for this is debated. Despite the dangers, Vikings routinely sailed across the North Sea, the North Atlantic, and even down the coasts of Western Europe to the Mediterranean. Their confidence and expertise at sea were unmatched in their time. Religion and mythology. The Vikings practiced a polytheistic religion, worshipping a pantheon of gods and goddesses who embodied different aspects of the world and human experience. At the head of the pantheon was Odin, the All-Father. Odin was the god of wisdom, war, death, and magic. He was a complex figure, often depicted as a wanderer seeking knowledge. He sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from the well of wisdom. He hung himself on the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 nights to learn the runes, the sacred alphabet that held magical power. Odin presided over Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where warriors who died in battle were brought by the Valkyries, female figures who chose the bravest of the fallen. In Valhalla, the warriors feasted and fought, preparing for Ragnarok, the end of the world. Thor was perhaps the most popular god among ordinary Vikings. The god of thunder, Thor wielded a mighty hammer named Mjolnir, which could level mountains. He defended the gods and humanity against giants and other threats. Thor was associated with strength, protection, and fertility. His symbols, small hammer amulets, were worn for protection and have been found in graves across Scandinavia. Freyja was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and war. She received half of the slain warriors, the other half going to Odin. Freyja rode a chariot pulled by cats and possessed a magical cloak of falcon feathers that allowed her to fly. Frey, Freyja's brother, was the god of fertility, prosperity, and fair weather. He was invoked for good harvests and peace. Loki was the trickster god, a shapeshifter who caused as much trouble as he solved. Loki fathered monstrous children, including Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the world serpent, and Hel, the ruler of the underworld. Despite his chaotic nature, Loki was counted among the gods, at least until his betrayal set off the events leading to Ragnarok. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, was a central myth. It was prophesied that Loki and his monstrous children would break free of their bonds and lead an army against the gods. A great battle would ensue. Many gods, including Odin and Thor, would die. The world would burn and sink into the sea. But after this destruction, the world would be reborn, green and fertile, and a new generation of gods and humans would live in peace. This cyclical view of time, destruction followed by renewal, reflects the harsh realities of Viking life, where prosperity and disaster often alternated. Religious practices were varied. There were no churches or temples in the early Viking Age, though by the late period, some structures dedicated to the gods were built. Most worship was conducted at outdoor sites, in groves, or at large stones. Sacrifices were important. Animals, especially horses and pigs, were sacrificed to the gods and then eaten in communal feasts. Human sacrifice occurred, though less frequently, usually prisoners or slaves offered in times of great need. Priests and priestesses, called Gothi and Githia, presided over rituals, but there was no centralized religious authority. Each community managed its own religious affairs. Magic and sorcery were also part of the belief system. Side, a form of shamanistic magic, was practiced to foretell the future, influence events, or harm enemies. It was associated with women, though some men practiced it, often at the cost of their reputation, as it was considered unmanly. The dead were treated with care. Burial practices varied. Some were buried in mounds with grave goods, weapons, jewelry, tools, even ships. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships were royal burials, the deceased interred within the ship, along with treasures and sacrificed animals. Others were cremated, their ashes placed in urns or scattered. The afterlife was not uniform. Warriors hoped for Valhalla or Frasier's Hall, Folkvanger. Others went to Hell, the underworld, which was not necessarily a place of punishment, but rather a shadowy existence. The details of these beliefs varied by region and over time. The conversion to Christianity. As Vikings settled in Christian lands and interacted more with Christian societies, Christianity began to spread in Scandinavia. The conversion was gradual and uneven, spanning several centuries. Missionaries ventured north, seeking to convert the heathens. Ansgar, the Apostle of the North, travelled to Denmark and Sweden in the 9th century, establishing the first churches, though his efforts had limited immediate impact. Kings played a crucial role in the conversion. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth converted around 960 and erected the Jelling Stone, a massive runestone proclaiming that Harald had made the Danes Christian. The motivations were partly political. Christianity provided legitimacy and connections to the broader European world. It also allowed kings to consolidate power as the church supported centralized authority. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason and later Olaf Haraldsson, also known as Saint Olaf, aggressively promoted Christianity in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. They destroyed temples, executed those who refused to convert, and established churches. Their methods were harsh, but Christianity gradually took root. Sweden was the last to convert, the process stretching into the 12th century. The temple at Uppsala, dedicated to Odin, Thor, and Freyr, reportedly continued to function until the late 11th century. Iceland's conversion was unique. In the year 999 or 1000, the Althing debated whether to adopt Christianity. The law speaker, Thorgeir Thorkelson, mediated the dispute. After a day and night of contemplation, he declared that Iceland would become Christian, though private worship of the old gods would still be allowed. This compromise avoided civil war and allowed a relatively smooth transition. The Christianization of Scandinavia marked the end of the Viking Age, though the exact endpoint is debated. As the Scandinavian kingdoms became Christian, they integrated more fully into the European political and cultural sphere. Raiding declined, partly because Christian rulers could no longer justify attacking fellow Christians, and partly because the kingdoms themselves became more stable and centralized. But the transition was not abrupt. Pagan practices persisted alongside Christian ones for generations. Beliefs blended. Old gods were remembered in folklore. Churches were built on the sites of old temples. Christianity adapted to Scandinavian culture even as it transformed it. Viking warfare and weaponry. Vikings were feared as warriors, and with good reason. Their tactics, weaponry, and ferocity made them formidable opponents. The primary Viking weapon was the spear. Spears were versatile, effective, and relatively inexpensive to produce. They could be thrust in close combat or thrown. Most warriors carried at least one spear. Swords were prized but expensive. A good sword was a status symbol, often given a name and passed down through generations. Viking swords were typically double-edged, about 90 centimeters long. The best blades were imported from the Frankish kingdoms, where superior steelmaking techniques produced stronger, sharper weapons. Axes were also common. The Dane axe, a long-handled battle axe, became iconic. It could be wielded with both hands to deliver devastating blows. Axes were also practical tools, used for chopping wood and building, making them a sensible weapon for men who were farmers as much as fighters. For defense, Vikings used shields, usually round and made of wood covered with leather, with an iron boss in the center. Shields were painted, often in bright colors. A shield wall, where warriors stood side by side with shields overlapping, was a standard defensive formation. Armor varied by wealth. Chainmail was effective but expensive, so only the wealthy could afford it. Most warriors wore padded leather or thick woolen garments for protection. Helmets, when worn, were simple iron caps. The popular image of Vikings with horned helmets is a myth. No horned Viking helmet has ever been found. That misconception arose in the 19th century. Viking tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Raiders struck quickly, often at dawn, before defenders could organize. They avoided prolonged sieges, preferring targets that could be plundered and abandoned rapidly. In pitched battles, Vikings relied on the shield wall and the courage of individual warriors. Berserkers, legendary warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, were said to be impervious to pain and fear. Whether berserkers were actually fearless or simply psychologically conditioned, possibly through rituals or substances, is debated, but their reputation terrified enemies. Viking armies were not professional standing forces, but rather levies of free men obligated to serve their chieftains. Leadership was earned through prowess and generosity. A successful leader attracted followers by sharing plunder and granting gifts, forging bonds of loyalty. Trade and economy. Vikings were not just raiders, they were also shrewd traders and skilled craftsmen, and trade was as important to the Viking Age as warfare. Scandinavia produced goods that were highly valued elsewhere. Furs from the north, especially from animals like foxes, marten, and beaver, were luxurious and warm. Walrus ivory, obtained from walrus hunted in the Arctic, was used for carving and was almost as valuable as elephant ivory. Amber, fossilized tree resin found along the Baltic coasts, was prized for jewelry. Vikings traded these goods for silver, which was the primary currency of the age. Silver coins, jewelry, and hack silver, pieces of cut-up silver objects, circulated widely. Merchants weighed silver to determine value, and scales and weights have been found in many Viking graves and settlements. The trade routes stretched vast distances. From Scandinavia, traders travelled to the British Isles, the Frankish kingdoms, the Baltic regions, and down the rivers of Russia to Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates. In Baghdad, Basra, and other cities of the Abbasid Caliphate, Scandinavian merchants sold furs, slaves, and amber, receiving silk, spices, and silver dirhams in return. Hedeby, located in what is now northern Germany, but then part of Danish territory, was one of the major Viking trading hubs. It sat at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, where goods could be transferred between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of diverse crafts: metalworking, glass bead making, comb carving, shipbuilding. Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, was another important trading centre. It had a population of perhaps 700 to 1,000 people at its height in the 10th century. Merchants from all over the Baltic and beyond visited Birka, exchanging goods and information. Dublin, York, and Novgorod also thrived as Viking trading cities. Dublin became a major slave market. Captives taken in raids were sold there, then often exported to other markets in Europe and the Islamic world. The slave trade was lucrative and morally troubling, a reminder that Viking society, like many medieval societies, accepted practices we now find abhorrent. Trade goods flowed both ways. Vikings imported wine, glass, fine textiles, and weapons. They valued exotic items, things that demonstrated wealth and connections to distant lands. Art and craftsmanship. Viking art is distinctive, characterized by intricate interlacing patterns, stylized animals, and a love of complexity and symmetry. Several artistic styles emerged over the Viking Age, each named after a site where characteristic examples were found. The Oseberg style, from the early 9th century, features gripping beasts, creatures with paws that grip their own bodies or the border of the design. The Boré style, from the mid-9th to late 10th century, features more geometric patterns and interlaced ribbons. The Jelling style, late 10th century, is named after the decorations on the Jelling stone. It features more naturalistic animals, often serpents or dragons, with less emphasis on geometric patterns. The Mammen style, overlapping with Jelling, shows even greater detail and realism. The Ringerike style, from the late 10th and early 11th centuries, and the Ern style, from the late 11th century into the 12th, represent the culmination of Viking art. Urns, in particular, features elongated, sinuous animals and plants intertwined in elegant compositions. These late styles show influence from Christian art as Scandinavia converted. Viking artisans worked in many mediums. Wood carving adorned ships, buildings, and everyday objects. Metal workers produced intricate jewellery, weapons with decorated hilts and scabbards, and brooches. Stone carvers created runestones and memorial monuments. Runestones are particularly evocative. These standing stones, often over 2 meters tall, were erected to commemorate the dead, record achievements, or mark important events. They were inscribed with runes, the angular alphabet used by Germanic peoples. The inscriptions are often formulaic. X raised this stone in memory of Y, his father, a good man. But they sometimes include more detail. expeditions to distant lands, battles fought, conversions to Christianity. Thousands of runestones survive, mostly in Sweden, with smaller numbers in Norway, Denmark, and areas where Vikings settled. They provide invaluable information about individuals, places, and events that might otherwise be lost. Women in Viking society. Women in Viking society had more rights and autonomy than many of their contemporaries in medieval Europe, though they were still subject to a patriarchal system. Women could own property, inherit wealth, and manage farms. When men were away on raids or trading voyages, which could last months or years, women ran the household and made important decisions. A wife held the keys to the storehouse and the coffers, a symbol of her authority over domestic affairs. Women could divorce their husbands, though the process involved legal procedures and the return of dowries. Reasons for divorce included mistreatment, infidelity, or simple incompatibility. Divorced women could remarry or live independently if they had sufficient means. Some women were buried with considerable wealth, indicating their high status. The Oseberg burial, one of the most famous Viking graves, contained 2 women, along with a ship, carts, animals, and numerous luxurious items. The identity of these women is debated, but they were clearly important, possibly a queen and her servant or priestess. Women participated in religious life. Priestesses, or Githia, conducted rituals and may have practiced Sida, the shamanistic magic. The sagas speak of Velvas, wandering seers who foretold the future and were treated with respect and fear. But women were generally excluded from warfare. The sagas mention shield maidens, women who fought as warriors, but whether these were real or mythological is unclear. In recent years, a grave at Birka was reanalyzed, and DNA testing revealed that a skeleton buried with weapons and gaming pieces, long assumed to be a male warrior, was actually female. This has sparked debate. Was she a warrior, or was the burial symbolic? The question remains open. Most women's work was domestic, cooking, cleaning, weaving, caring for children and the elderly. But this work was essential to the survival and prosperity of the household and was valued. The end of the Viking Age. The Viking Age did not end abruptly. It faded over the course of the 11th and early 12th centuries as Scandinavia transformed. One marker is the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway and former Varangian, invaded England, claiming the throne. He was met by King Harold Godwinson of England at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. The battle was fierce, but the English won, and Harald Hardrada was killed. It was the last major Viking invasion of England. Ironically, just days later, Harold Godwinson marched south to face another invasion, this time by William of Normandy, a descendant of Vikings who had settled in France. William won the Battle of Hastings, and the Norman conquest began, bringing England under Norman control. The Normans were culturally French by this point, but their Viking heritage was evident in their martial prowess and administrative skills. Another marker is the Christian consolidation of Scandinavia. By the early 12th century, the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were firmly Christian and increasingly centralized. Kings wielded greater power, supported by the church and feudal structures. The Crusades also redirected Scandinavian martial energy. Norwegian and Danish kings led expeditions to the Holy Land, fighting as Christian knights rather than heathen raiders. This integration into Christendom marked a shift in identity and purpose. Trade continued, but it became more regularized. The Hanseatic League, a commercial alliance of towns in northern Europe, began to dominate Baltic trade in the 12th and 13th centuries, marginalizing Scandinavian merchants to some extent. Politically, the Scandinavian kingdoms turned inward, consolidating their territories and dealing with internal conflicts. The age of expansion was over. The focus was now on building stable Christian kingdoms that could participate in the broader European political system. Iceland, Greenland, and the Atlantic Islands remained connected to Scandinavia, but even they changed. Iceland became a dependency of Norway in 1262, losing its independence. Greenland's Norse settlements, as mentioned, eventually disappeared. The Viking Age left a profound legacy. The Scandinavian settlements in England, Ireland, Scotland, and France influenced language, law, and culture. English contains hundreds of words of Old Norse origin: sky, knife, egg, window, they, their, them. Many legal concepts, like the jury system, have roots in Scandinavian practices. The Kievan ruse became the foundation for the Russian state, shaping Eastern Europe's development. The explorations to Iceland, Greenland, and North America demonstrated remarkable nautical skill and adventurous spirit. Culturally, the Sagas and Eddas preserved a rich literary tradition. These texts, written down in the 13th century but recounting earlier events, provide a window into Viking thought, values, and worldview. The popular image of Vikings has evolved over time. In the medieval period, they were often portrayed as barbaric heathens. In the 19th century, Romantic nationalists in Scandinavia rehabilitated them as heroic ancestors. In modern times, they're seen more nuancedly as complex people capable of both brutality and beauty, destruction and creation. The Viking language and runes. The Vikings spoke Old Norse, a North Germanic language that was the ancestor of modern Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and Faroese. Old Norse was remarkably uniform across Scandinavia during the Viking Age, though regional dialects existed. A Dane could understand a Norwegian, and both could converse with a Swede without too much difficulty. This linguistic unity facilitated trade, diplomacy, and the transmission of culture across vast distances. When a Viking from Norway settled in Iceland, or when a Swedish merchant travelled to Novgorod, language was rarely a barrier. Old Norse had a rich vocabulary for seafaring and warfare, reflecting the priorities of Viking culture. There were numerous words for different types of ships, sea conditions, and battle formations. Poetry and storytelling were highly valued, and the language was full of kennings, metaphorical compound expressions. The sea might be called the whale road. A warrior might be the feeder of ravens, since ravens feasted on battlefield dead. A sword could be the serpent of wounds. The runic alphabet, called the Futhark after its first 6 letters, was used for inscriptions. Runes were angular, designed to be carved into wood, bone, or stone. The Elder Futhark, used by Germanic peoples before the Viking Age, had 24 characters. During the Viking Age, this was simplified to the younger Futhark with only 16 runes. Runes were more than just letters. They were believed to have magical properties. The word rune itself meant secret or mystery. Rune masters could supposedly influence events by carving the right symbols. Protective runes might be carved on weapons or amulets. Curses could be inscribed on stones or wooden sticks. Most Vikings were illiterate. Reading and writing were specialized skills practiced by merchants, chieftains, and a few others. The vast majority of communication was oral. Stories, laws, genealogies, and traditions were memorized and recited. This oral culture was rich and sophisticated, but it also meant that much was lost over time, especially after the conversion to Christianity and the adoption of the Latin alphabet. The Sagas and Eddas that preserve Old Norse literature were written down in the 13th century, more than 200 years after the end of the Viking Age. By then, the language had evolved and memories had faded or been embellished. What we have is invaluable, but it's also a selective and somewhat romanticized record. Viking law and justice. Vikings had elaborate legal systems, though they differed from modern notions of law and justice. There was no police force or state-run courts. Instead, justice was administered by assemblies called things. At the local level, there were small things where disputes were resolved. At the regional level, larger things handled more serious matters. In some places, like Iceland, there was a national thing, the Althing, that served as the supreme legal authority. Things were gatherings of free men. Thralls and women could not participate directly, though they could be represented by a male relative or protector. At a thing, disputes were presented, evidence was heard, and decisions were made. The process was public and oral. There were no written records until much later. Laws were recited by a law speaker, an individual who had memorized the entire legal code. In Iceland, the law speaker had to recite 1/3 of the law each year at the Althing, so that the entire code was repeated every 3 years. This ensured continuity and accuracy in an oral culture. Punishments varied. For minor offences, fines were common. The amount depended on the severity of the offence and the status of the victim. Killing a thrall resulted in a smaller fine than killing a free farmer, which in turn was less than killing a jarl. For serious crimes like murder, outlawry was a common punishment. An outlaw lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill them without penalty. Their property was forfeit. They were expected to leave the community, often fleeing to another region or even another country. Outlawry came in 2 forms: lesser outlawry, lasting 3 years, and full outlawry, lasting for life. The system relied heavily on honour and reputation. A man's word was his bond. Oath swearing was a serious matter. If accused of a crime, one could swear an oath of innocence, and if others, called oath helpers, supported the oath, the case might be dismissed. But swearing a false oath was a grave offence that could destroy one's reputation. Feuds were common. If someone killed your kinsman, you had the right, even the obligation, to seek revenge. This could lead to cycles of violence, with killings prompting counter-killings. To prevent endless bloodshed, compensation payments were negotiated. The killer's family would pay wergild, a man price, to the victim's family. If both sides agreed, the feud ended. If not, violence continued. The legal system was designed to maintain social order in a society without a strong central authority. It worked reasonably well, though it favoured the wealthy and powerful who could afford to pay compensation or gather supporters to intimidate opponents. Viking raids, tactics and impact. The Viking raids that terrorized medieval Europe followed certain patterns. Understanding these patterns helps us appreciate both the Vikings' effectiveness and the responses of their victims. Most raids occurred in summer. The seas were calmer, the days longer, and the weather more predictable. Winter voyages were possible but dangerous, and Vikings generally avoided them unless necessary. Targets were chosen carefully. Monasteries were ideal. They were wealthy, poorly defended, and located near coasts or rivers, making them accessible by ship. Churches held gold and silver liturgical objects, jeweled reliquaries, fine vestments. Monks, who could read and write, might be captured and ransomed or sold as slaves. Towns and markets were also attractive targets. They concentrated wealth and goods, but towns were more likely to have defences, walls, or local militias, so attacking them was riskier. The element of surprise was crucial. Viking longships could approach quietly, hugging the coast or sailing at night. They would beach suddenly, and warriors would pour ashore, overwhelming any resistance before it could organise. Once ashore, the Vikings moved quickly. They looted valuables, seized livestock, captured people, and burned buildings. The goal was to gather as much wealth as possible in a short time, then retreat before reinforcements arrived. Defenders often had little warning. Coastal watchtowers could provide some alert, but by the time word spread, the Vikings might already be gone. Even if a local lord gathered his forces, the Vikings were usually back on their ships and away before he arrived. This hit and run strategy was devastatingly effective. It was also psychologically damaging. Communities lived in constant fear. Coastal areas were particularly vulnerable, and some were abandoned entirely as people moved inland seeking safety. Over time, defensive measures improved. Alfred the Great's system of burhs in Wessex is a prime example. These fortified towns, spaced so that no one was more than 20 miles from refuge, provided safe havens and bases for counterattacks. The burh system made raiding Wessex much more difficult and costly. In Francia, Charles the Bald organised similar defences and built fortified bridges to block river passages. These measures didn't eliminate Viking raids, but reduced their effectiveness. Victims also began paying Danegeld, tribute payments to buy off the raiders. The term comes from England, where kings paid vast sums of silver to Viking armies in exchange for peace. The first recorded Danegeld was in 865, and payments continued intermittently for over a century. Danegeld was controversial. It provided temporary relief, but also incentivized further raids. Vikings who received payment one year often returned the next, demanding more. The funds came from heavy taxation, burdening the population. Yet, from a king's perspective, it could be a pragmatic choice. Fighting cost money and lives. If paying the Vikings averted a destructive war, it might be worth it. The long-term impact of Viking raids was profound. They disrupted trade, destroyed cultural treasures, and caused significant loss of life. Some regions never fully recovered. In Ireland, many monasteries were abandoned or moved inland. In England, learning and literacy declined as monastic communities, the centres of education were decimated. But the impact wasn't uniformly negative. The pressure of Viking raids accelerated political consolidation. In England, Wessex emerged as the dominant kingdom, partly because Alfred and his successors effectively organised defence. The threat from outside helped create a unified English identity. Similarly, in Francia, the Viking threat contributed to the decentralisation that eventually led to feudalism, as local lords took greater responsibility for defence when central authority proved inadequate. Viking settlements, from camps to cities. While raiding brought wealth and fame, settlement brought land and long-term security. Viking settlements varied widely depending on location and context. In England, the Danelaw saw extensive Scandinavian settlement. Farmers from Denmark and Norway migrated, bringing their families and livestock. They established villages, farmed the land, and intermarried with the local population. Archaeological evidence shows a blending of cultures. Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian styles of pottery, jewellery, and building techniques are found side by side. Language also blended. Old English absorbed hundreds of Old Norse words, and in some areas a hybrid Anglo-Norse dialect emerged. York, or Jorvik, became the capital of a Viking kingdom that lasted from 866 to 954. The city thrived as a trading centre. Excavations at Coppergate, a street in York, have revealed workshops, houses, and thousands of artefacts. Craftsmen produced leather goods, metalwork, and textiles. The city was cosmopolitan, with links to Dublin, Scandinavia, and beyond. In Ireland, the Vikings founded coastal towns that became major urban centres. Dublin, established around 841, grew from a fortified camp into a bustling port. It had a harbour that could accommodate large fleets, markets where goods from across the Viking world were traded, and a slave market that was one of the largest in Western Europe. Waterford, founded in 914, and Limerick, established in the mid-9th century, also became important cities. These towns introduced urban life to Ireland on a scale previously unknown. Before the Vikings, Ireland was a rural society. The Norsemen brought the concept of permanent, fortified trading towns. However, integration was slower in Ireland than in England. The Norse-Irish settlements remained culturally distinct for longer. Gaelic kings and Norse rulers fought and allied in complex patterns. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where the High King Brian Boru defeated a coalition of Norse and Gaelic forces, is often seen as a turning point, though the Norse presence continued for centuries. In Scotland, the Northern and Western Isles saw heavy settlement. The indigenous Pictish culture was largely replaced by Norse culture in these areas. The Orkney Islands in particular became a powerful earldom. The Earls of Orkney ruled not just the islands, but also controlled parts of northern Scotland and had influence extending to the Hebrides and even Iceland. The Orkneyinga saga, written in Iceland, chronicles the history of the Orkney Earls. It's a mix of history, legend, and poetry, detailing feuds, battles, and the daily lives of the island's rulers. The saga illustrates how Norse culture dominated the region for centuries. In Normandy, the Viking settlement took a different path. The Normans, as they became known, quickly adopted French language and customs. Within 2 or 3 generations, They were indistinguishable from other French nobles, except in their exceptional martial prowess and administrative efficiency. The Duchy of Normandy became one of the most powerful and well-governed territories in France. Norman lords built castles, established monasteries, and patronized the arts. They developed a feudal system that was more organized than many contemporary regions. This system was later exported to England after the Norman conquest of 1066. In the east, Viking settlements in Russia were primarily trading posts and military strongholds. Novgorod, Kiev, and other towns along the river routes served as bases for trade with Byzantium and the Islamic world. The Varangians married into Slavic nobility, adopted Slavic language and customs, and within a few generations were more Slavic than Scandinavian. Yet their legacy persisted in the political structures and trade networks they established. The role of slaves in Viking society. Slavery was an integral part of Viking society, and the slave trade was a significant economic activity. This is one of the darker aspects of the Viking Age, and it's important to acknowledge it honestly. Slaves, called thralls in Old Norse, were captured in raids, born to slave parents, or sometimes sold into slavery due to debt or crime. The majority were likely war captives, taken from the British Isles, the Baltic regions, and the Slavic lands. The word slave itself derives from Slav, reflecting the large numbers of Slavic people enslaved during the medieval period, many of them trafficked by Vikings and other traders. Thralls performed hard labour, farming, building, rowing ships, mining, and any other task their owners demanded. They had no legal rights and could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed with impunity. Their children were born into slavery, perpetuating the system. In households, thralls did the dirtiest and most exhausting work. In agricultural areas, they cleared land, planted and harvested crops, and tended animals. In workshops, they assisted craftsmen, doing the repetitive and unskilled tasks. Female thralls often served as domestic servants and concubines. They had no power to refuse their master's sexual demands. Children born of such unions might be raised as free if the father acknowledged them, but they could also remain enslaved. Despite their low status, some thralls could improve their situation. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, did occur, though it was not common. A thrall might be freed as a reward for loyal service, or upon their owner's death as an act of piety, especially after Christianization. Freed slaves, called freedmen, occupied a middle status. They were no longer enslaved, but lacked the full rights of the freeborn. The Viking slave trade extended across Europe and beyond. Dublin was a major slave market. Captives taken in raids on England, Scotland, and Wales were brought there and sold to Norse traders, who might take them to Scandinavia or farther afield to the Mediterranean or the Islamic world. The Islamic caliphates had a high demand for slaves. Viking traders transported Slavic captives down the Volga River to markets in Central Asia and the Middle East, where they were sold for silver. This trade was lucrative and contributed significantly to Viking wealth. After the Christianization of Scandinavia, slavery gradually declined. The Church discouraged the enslavement of Christians, though this principle was often ignored. Economic changes also played a role. As Scandinavian societies became more settled and feudal structures developed, serfdom and tenant farming replaced outright slavery in many areas. By the end of the Viking Age, slavery was less prominent in Scandinavia, though it didn't disappear entirely until much later. The legacy of the Viking slave trade, however, was profound. It caused immense suffering and contributed to the Vikings' fearsome reputation. Viking food and feasting. Food in Viking society was simple but sustaining, and feasting was an important social and political activity. The typical diet was based on grains, dairy, fish, and meat. Bread and porridge made from barley, oats, or rye were staples. Butter, cheese, and curds from cows, goats, and sheep provided fat and protein. Fish, both freshwater and saltwater, was abundant and consumed regularly, either fresh or preserved by drying, smoking, or salting. Meat was eaten less frequently than fish, but was highly prized. Pork, beef, mutton, and goat were the most common meats. Chickens provided eggs and occasional meat. Wild game, such as deer, boar, hare, and birds, supplemented domesticated animals, especially for those living near forests. Vegetables included cabbages, onions, leeks, peas, and beans. Wild plants like nettles, dandelions, and berries were gathered. Apples, plums, and cherries grew in some regions. Nuts, especially hazelnuts, were collected and stored. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar was unknown in Scandinavia. Honey was also fermented into mead, a popular alcoholic drink. Beer, brewed from barley, was the most common beverage. Wine was imported and consumed by the wealthy. Food preservation was essential for surviving the long winters. Grain was stored in barrels or pits. Meat and fish were smoked, salted, or dried. Dairy products were made into cheese that could last months. Vegetables were pickled or stored in root cellars. Cooking was done over an open fire. Pots and cauldrons of iron or soapstone hung from chains above the hearth. Meat was roasted on spits. Bread was baked on flat stones or in simple ovens. Meals were communal. The household ate together, seated on benches at long tables. Food was served in wooden bowls and eaten with knives and fingers. Spoons were used for soups and porridge, but forks were not yet in use. Feasting was a central element of Viking culture. Feasts marked important occasions, weddings, funerals, seasonal festivals, victories in battle, the completion of major projects like a ship or building. They were occasions for display, generosity, and social bonding. A successful chieftain or king demonstrated his wealth and power by hosting lavish feasts. The hall would be filled with followers, allies, and guests. Long tables would groan under the weight of roasted meats, bread, cheeses, and imported delicacies. Mead and beer flowed freely. Entertainment accompanied the feast. Skalds, poet-singers, recited poems and sagas, often composed to honour the host or commemorate recent deeds. Musicians played lyres, harps, and flutes. Riddles and word games were popular. Sometimes acrobats or jugglers performed. Feasting reinforced social hierarchies and alliances. The seating arrangement reflected status. The most honoured guests sat closest to the host. Gifts were exchanged. The host might give rings, weapons, or fine cloth to favoured guests, strengthening bonds of loyalty. Guests in turn praised the host's generosity and swore support. Feasts could last for days. the saga of Olaf Tryggvason describes a feast that lasted 12 days. While this may be an exaggeration, it indicates the scale and importance of such events. But feasting also had a competitive edge. A chieftain who could not host an impressive feast risked losing prestige and followers. Conversely, a generous host gained fame and loyalty. The economics of gift-giving and feasting were complex, balancing immediate expenditure against long-term social and political gains. Women's roles revisited, power and limitations. While we've touched on women's roles, it's worth exploring further the nuances of their position in Viking society. Women managed households, which in a pre-industrial society meant overseeing significant economic activity. They supervised the production of food, textiles, and other goods. They managed servants and thralls. They made decisions about resource allocation, especially when husbands were away. Weaving and textile production were particularly important. Women spun wool and flax into thread, wove cloth on upright looms, and sewed garments. This was not just domestic work, but also economic activity. Cloth was valuable, used for trade and as gifts. High-quality textiles could be as precious as silver. Some women held religious authority. As mentioned, priestesses and velvas practiced divination and ritual. Their status was ambiguous, respected for their spiritual power, but sometimes feared or marginalized. Women could own property, though inheritance laws often favored men. A daughter might inherit if there were no sons, but the exact rules varied by region and time. Women could buy and sell land, livestock, and slaves. Marriage was a contract between families, and women had some say, though their consent was sometimes more formalistic than real. A father or guardian arranged marriages considering alliances, economics, and social standing, but sources suggest that women's preferences were taken into account, at least among the free and wealthy. Divorce was possible, as noted. A woman could initiate divorce for reasons including physical abuse, infidelity, or her husband's inability to provide. She would reclaim her dowry and any property she brought to the marriage. In practice, divorce was easier for the wealthy, who could afford the legal and social costs. Widows had significant autonomy. A widow inherited her husband's property and could manage it as she saw fit. She could remarry or remain single. Many widows appear in the sagas as powerful figures, managing estates and influencing politics. Yet women were excluded from direct political power. They could not attend things or hold formal leadership positions, with rare exceptions. They could not serve as law speakers or judges. Their influence was exerted indirectly through sons, brothers, and husbands. Violence against women was a concern. The sagas and laws address rape, abduction, and domestic abuse. Penalties existed, though enforcement depended on the woman's family's power. A woman from a powerful family could expect her kinsmen to seek justice or revenge. A woman without such support had fewer protections. The question of shield maidens remains contentious. The Birka warrior burial, with a female skeleton buried with weapons, suggests that some women may have participated in warfare, at least occasionally. But whether this was common or exceptional is unclear. Most scholars lean toward exceptional, perhaps women of very high status or unique circumstances. In comparison to many contemporary societies, Viking women had relatively high status. They were not secluded or veiled. they could own property and divorce. But they were still subordinate to men in many ways, and their freedoms varied by class and circumstance. The influence of climate and geography. Geography and climate shaped Viking culture and expansion profoundly. Scandinavia's environment presented both challenges and opportunities. The landscape was rugged. Norway, in particular, has mountains, fjords, and limited arable land. Only about 3% of Norway is suitable for agriculture, mostly in narrow valleys and coastal plains. This scarcity of farmland created pressure. As population grew, younger sons who wouldn't inherit the family farm had to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The sea was both barrier and highway. The Atlantic was dangerous, but Scandinavians became expert sailors out of necessity. Fishing was vital. The coast teemed with cod, herring, and other fish. Whaling, though less common, provided meat, oil, and bone. Sweden had more farmland, especially in the central plains, but it also faced pressure. The Baltic Sea and the rivers flowing into it provided access to trade routes extending deep into the continent. Swedish Vikings, the Varangians, exploited these routes, travelling to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. Denmark, being flatter and with more arable land, supported a denser population. It was also strategically located, controlling the entrance to the Baltic. This made Denmark wealthy and powerful. Danish kings could tax ships passing through the straits, and Danish raiders had easy access to both the Baltic and the North Sea. The climate during the Viking Age was generally favourable. The period from roughly 800 to 1200 is known as the medieval warm period. Temperatures were slightly warmer than the preceding centuries, allowing for agricultural expansion. Greenland's Norse settlements, for instance, depended on this warmer climate. When the climate cooled during the Little Ice Age, from about 1300 to 1850, conditions in Greenland became much harsher, contributing to the settlement's decline. Seasonal rhythms governed life. Winters were long and dark. In northern Scandinavia, the sun might not rise for weeks during midwinter. People stayed indoors, conserving energy and resources. Summers, conversely, had long days, sometimes with sun at midnight. This was the time for farming, fishing, raiding, and travel. The division of the year into summer and winter was fundamental. The Old Norse calendar was based on this binary. There were only 2 seasons. Summer began in April and lasted until October. Winter covered the rest. The transition, marked by festivals, was significant. Geography also influenced expansion patterns. Norwegians, hemmed in by mountains and sea, looked west to the islands of Scotland, Iceland, and beyond. Swedes, with access to rivers flowing east, looked toward Russia and the east. Danes, controlling the Danish Straits, raided and settled in England and the Frankish kingdoms. The environment bred resilience and adaptability. Vikings had to cope with storms, cold, poor soil, and limited resources. These challenges fostered a culture that valued toughness, ingenuity, and community cooperation. The same qualities that allowed them to survive in Scandinavia also made them formidable abroad. Conclusion: the final reflections. As we draw toward the close of this long journey through the Viking Age, it's worth pausing to consider the human element. Behind the battles and voyages, The settlements and trade routes were individual people with hopes, fears, joys, and sorrows. A young man leaving his village in Norway, boarding a longship for the first time, sailing into the unknown. The mixture of excitement and terror, the camaraderie with his fellow warriors, the thrill of the first raid, the horror of violence and death. A woman in Iceland, standing at the door of her turf-roofed farmhouse, looking out over the treeless landscape, wondering if her husband and sons would return from a fishing trip or if the sea had claimed them. An enslaved Slav, torn from his homeland, sold in a Dublin market, transported to a farm in Denmark, labouring under a harsh master, dreaming of escape or perhaps of acceptance into the household. A craftsman in Hedeby, bent over his workbench, carefully carving a comb from bone, taking pride in his skill, bartering the finished product for grain or cloth, going home to his wife and children. A skald composing a poem, searching for the perfect metaphor, the turn of phrase that would immortalize a chieftain's deeds, standing before the fire in a crowded hall, reciting the verses, seeing the faces of the listeners rapt with attention. These were real people. Their world was different from ours in technology, in beliefs, in social structures, but their fundamental humanity was the same. They loved and hated. They worked and rested. They feared and hoped. They lived and died. The Viking Age was a time of tremendous change, violence, and creativity. It was a hinge period in European history, connecting the decline of the classical world with the rise of the medieval kingdoms. It spread Scandinavian influence across vast areas, from the North Atlantic to the Caspian Sea, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The Vikings were not just destroyers. They were also builders, traders, explorers, settlers, poets, and lawmakers. They created new societies in Iceland, Normandy, the Danelaw, and the Kievan Rus. They introduced new technologies, trade goods, and ideas. They challenged the existing order and, in doing so, helped shape the world that emerged after them. Their conversion to Christianity marked the end of an era, but also a transformation. The values of the pagan past, honour, courage, loyalty, persisted even as the religious framework changed. The Sagas, written down by Christian Icelanders, preserve a memory of that pagan world, though filtered through a new lens. Today, the Viking Age fascinates us. We romanticize the adventurous spirit, the seafaring prowess, the dramatic sagas. We are rightly critical of the violence, the slavery, the brutality. The Vikings were neither heroes nor villains, but complex people navigating a complex world. Consider how deeply the Vikings have shaped our modern world, often in ways we don't immediately recognize. In language, as we've mentioned, English bears the mark of Old Norse. Beyond individual words, the grammar itself was influenced. The pronouns they, their, and them are all from Old Norse, replacing the Old English forms. This happened because of the extensive contact between Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians in the Danelaw. When two language communities live side by side, especially when they speak related languages, simplification and borrowing occur naturally. Place names across northern England and eastern Ireland testify to Viking settlement. Derby, Rugby, Grimsby, Whitby, these towns with by endings were Scandinavian foundations or heavily influenced by Norse settlers. Thorpe, meaning village, appears in countless place names. Kirkby, meaning church settlement, shows the blend of Norse language and Christian religion. In Scotland, the influence is even more pronounced. Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, these island groups were so thoroughly Scandinavianized that Old Norse was spoken there for centuries after the end of the Viking Age. Scottish Gaelic borrowed many Norse words, especially related to the sea, fishing, and shipbuilding. In Ireland, the very concept of urban life owes much to the Vikings. Before their arrival, Ireland was a rural, agrarian society. The Norse established the first true towns: Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick. These became centres of trade, craft production, and governance, fundamentally changing Irish society. In Eastern Europe, the legacy is more subtle but no less significant. The Kievan ruse gave rise to the Russian state and influenced the development of Ukraine and Belarus. The trade routes established by Varangians connected northern Europe to Byzantium and the Islamic world, facilitating cultural and economic exchange for centuries. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was carried out by descendants of Vikings who had settled in Normandy. While the Normans were culturally French, their organisational skills, military prowess, and ambition reflected their Scandinavian heritage. The Normans transformed England, introducing feudalism, building castles, reorganising the church, and leaving a profound mark on law, language, and governance. Normans also conquered southern Italy and Sicily in the 11th century, establishing kingdoms that blended Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic elements. They participated in the Crusades, founding the Principality of Antioch. Norman influence extended across the Mediterranean, far from the cold northern seas where their ancestors had once raided. In Iceland, the literary legacy of the Vikings is unparalleled. The Sagas and Eddas are masterpieces of medieval literature. They offer insights into pre-Christian Scandinavian beliefs, social structures, and values. Works like Njal's Saga, Egil's Saga, and the Volsunga Saga have inspired countless writers, artists, and composers. J.R.R. Tolkien, for instance, drew heavily on Old Norse mythology and sagas when creating Middle-earth. The Eddas preserve the myths of Odin, Thor, Freya, and the other gods. These myths have become part of global culture, adapted and reinterpreted in literature, film, and popular media. Marvel's Thor, though far removed from the original, shows how these ancient stories still resonate. Viking aesthetics, the intricate interlacing patterns, the stylized animals, the runes, have influenced modern design. Jewelry, tattoos, and artwork often incorporate Viking motifs. Museums across Scandinavia and beyond display Viking artifacts, ships, and treasures, attracting millions of visitors who marvel at the craftsmanship and artistry. Politically, the Vikings contributed to the development of parliamentary systems. The Icelandic Althing, established around 930, is considered one of the oldest parliaments in the world. While it ceased to function as an independent legislative body when Iceland came under Norwegian rule, it was revived in the modern era and remains the national parliament of Iceland today. The tradition of assembly-based governance, of resolving disputes through communal decision-making, is part of the democratic heritage of the Nordic countries. In maritime technology, the Viking longship was a marvel that influenced shipbuilding for centuries. The clinker-built technique, the shallow draft, the combination of oars and sail, these innovations were studied and adapted by later shipbuilders. The spirit of exploration that drove Vikings to Iceland, Greenland, and North America echoes in the later age of exploration, when Europeans crossed the Atlantic and Pacific, circumnavigated the globe, and mapped the world. The Vikings remind us that history is made by those who dare to venture beyond the familiar, who are willing to take risks, who adapt to new circumstances. They also remind us of the costs of such ventures, the violence, the exploitation, the suffering inflicted and endured. As you drift now into sleep, let these final thoughts settle gently. The Vikings were people of their time, shaped by their environment and circumstances, yet also individuals who made choices, who had agency, who left marks on the world that endure long after their own lives ended. The longships have rotted away, except for those preserved in museums and burials. The chieftains and kings are dust. The monasteries they raided have been rebuilt or left in ruins. The treasures have been scattered, melted down, or lost. But the stories remain, the influence remains, the legacy remains. And now, as the final words of this long journey through the Viking Age draw to a close, let yourself release all the details, all the dates and names and places. Let them fade like mist over a fjord at dawn. What remains is the essence, the human drive to explore and expand, the complexity of cultures that are both creative and destructive, the long arc of history, stretching from the ancient past into our present and beyond, into the unknowable future. Rest now. Sleep deeply. Let the rise and fall of empires, the voyages across stormy seas, the quiet moments in longhouses and workshops, all blend into the peaceful rhythm of your breath. The Viking Age has ended, but the story of humanity continues, and you are part of it, connected through time to all who came before and all who will come after. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be gentle, filled with the whisper of distant shores and the soft glow of northern lights dancing over silent snow.